My name is Arden and I am 36 years old. At my dad's funeral, my brother announced he'd sell our family home to pay his gambling debts. $340,000, and those words landed harder than the sound of dirt hitting the coffin, because we were still standing under the chapel's dull lights when he cleared his throat, adjusted his black tie, and said it out loud like it was a weather update, not a betrayal, not the kind of sentence that cracks a family in half. The room smelled of lilies and old wood polish, and my mother sat beside him, her hands folded, nodding slowly as if she'd rehearsed the moment, as if grief had already taught her how to agree. And when someone whispered my name from the pew behind me, I felt my chest lock. Because the house he was talking about wasn't just property. It was the place where Dad taught me to ride a bike in the driveway and fixed the loose stair that always squeaked. The place where I moved back after my divorce with 2 suitcases and a promise to myself that I'd rebuild quietly. And yet my brother went on, explaining numbers like a salesman, saying the debts were urgent, unavoidable, that he'd made mistakes. And Mom nodded again and added, "Your dad would understand. Your sister can find another place." And the way she said sister instead of my name made it feel final, like I was already packed up and gone. People stared at the floor, pretending not to hear, pretending this was normal. But my hands were shaking, and I tasted metal in my mouth as memories collided with the present, Dad's laugh echoing down, the hallway, the smell of his coffee in the mornings, the night he sat me at the kitchen table and said, "No matter what happens, this house stays with you kids." And I remembered how he'd said it after my brother lost his job the first time. How he'd insisted the house was off limits, untouchable, because it was the one thing that couldn't be gambled away. My brother avoided my eyes, which told me everything. And when someone asked if the paperwork was ready, he said the realtor was already lined up, as if the funeral was just a convenient gathering to make it official, as if grief was a loophole. My mother squeezed his arm and repeated, "Your dad would understand." But I wanted to scream that she was wrong, that Dad would never have nodded along while one child swallowed the future of another. Yet my voice stayed stuck because funerals have rules, and daughters like me are taught to swallow their protests, especially when they've already been labeled the strong one. The minister cleared his throat, trying to steer us back to hymns, but the damage was done. And when my brother added that the debts were exactly $340,000, precise to the dollar, it felt like a receipt slapped on the coffin, proof that the house's memories had been reduced to a balance sheet. I looked around and saw pity instead of outrage, which hurt almost as much as the announcement itself. And I realized how alone I was in that room, how easily a narrative can be rewritten when the loudest voice speaks first. My brother's history with gambling wasn't a secret. Missed birthdays. Borrowed money never returned. Promises made with crossed fingers. But somehow, standing there in black clothes, he sounded reasonable to everyone else, like a man bravely facing consequences, and I sounded, in my own head, like an obstacle. I thought of the nights I paid the property tax when Dad got sick, the repairs I handled, the quiet understanding between Dad and me that the house was as much my responsibility as it was my refuge, and the injustice of it all burned so hot I had to sit down. Then, just as the murmurs swelled and the air thickened with awkward sympathy, a man in a dark suit I barely recognized stood up from the back pew, straightened his jacket and said, calmly but loudly enough to cut through the noise, "Actually, there's a document from 2009. The house isn't in the estate, it's—" And he paused, every head turning, my brother's face draining of color, my mother's nod freezing mid-motion. And in that suspended second, with my father's photograph watching from the altar, I felt the first crack of hope push through the grief, sharp and terrifying and real. Because whatever that sentence was about to become, it was clear that the story my brother had just announced at my dad's funeral wasn't finished yet. The lawyer's pause felt longer than the years. My brother had spent digging his hole, and when he finally finished his sentence, "The house isn't in the estate. It's held in a living trust." The room shifted, like air rushing back into lungs that didn't realize they'd stopped breathing. Because suddenly the story at my dad's funeral changed direction, and the words my brother had announced so confidently, at my dad's funeral. My brother announced he'd sell our family home to pay his gambling debts. $340,000. started to sound less like a decision and more like a failed bluff. The lawyer explained calmly and precisely that in 2009, my father had placed the house into a trust naming me as the sole beneficiary, effective upon his death. And he said it plainly without drama, but every syllable hit like a bell, because it meant the house was never part of the estate, never something my brother could sell, never leverage for his debts. And when my mother whispered, "That can't be right," the lawyer simply nodded and said, "Your husband was very clear," and I saw something crumble behind her eyes. Not just surprise, but the realization that Dad had made a choice she didn't expect. My brother stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly, demanding explanations, accusing the lawyer of mistakes, of manipulation, of siding with me, and for the first time since Dad died, I found my voice, telling him quietly that Dad had warned him, that he'd drawn boundaries, years ago because he loved us both, but refused to let addiction decide our future. And the room, which had earlier swallowed my silence, now leaned in to hear. The lawyer continued, explaining that Dad had anticipated this exact scenario, that he'd written notes about protecting the house from financial recklessness, words that made my brother flinch. And when the lawyer added that the trust also included a clause, allowing me to live there indefinitely, or sell at my discretion, I felt a strange mix of relief and grief, because Dad had been planning even while he was sick, thinking ahead for me, trusting me, and that trust felt heavier than ownership. My brother's anger turned desperate as he argued that family should help family, that his debts were crushing him, that selling the house would solve everything. But the lawyer responded with the same steady tone, saying the trust couldn't be overridden by emotion or pressure, and that my brother's debts were his responsibility alone. People began to murmur again. But this time the sympathy shifted, and I saw something new in their faces, understanding, even respect. And when my mother finally spoke, her voice was small as she said, "Your father didn't tell me." I realized how much of this was about control, about assumptions, about who was expected to sacrifice quietly. After the service ended, my brother cornered me outside, accusing me of betrayal, of turning Dad against him, and I told him the truth, that I'd never asked for this, that Dad had decided because he knew the house was my safety net, my rebuild, my anchor, and that his gambling debts weren't a family emergency anymore. They were a line he'd crossed alone. He stormed off, and I watched him go with a sadness that didn't erase the boundary but solidified it, because love doesn't mean surrendering your future to someone else's chaos. Later that evening, when the house was quiet and the funeral clothes hung heavy in the closet, I walked through each room, touching the walls, hearing Dad's voice in my head, remembering the promise he'd made. And I understood that the real inheritance wasn't bricks or land but the permission to stand firm. Weeks later, the story spread. How at my dad's funeral my brother announced he'd sell our family home to pay off his gambling debts. How my mom nodded and said, "Your dad would understand. Your sister can find another place." And how the lawyer stood up and revealed the truth, and people reached out. Not just to gossip, but to tell me they admired my father's foresight, that he'd protected me in a way many parents don't. And I learned that boundaries can look like cruelty to those who benefit from breaking them. My brother eventually entered a treatment program, not because the house was gone as an option, but because it finally wasn't there to rescue him. And my relationship with my mother remained complicated, strained by what she'd expected me to give up without question. But healing, I realized, doesn't always mean going back to how things were. Standing in the doorway of the family home one morning, sunlight filling the hallway, I felt grief and gratitude sit side by side, and I knew this story wasn't just about inheritance or revenge. It was about a man who loved his children enough to plan for the worst, and a daughter who learned that saying no can be an act of respect for yourself and for the person who trusted you. If this story hit you, if you believe in boundaries, justice, and quiet strength, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more real, powerful stories like this.